Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Paramita and I heartily welcome you to my channel Paramita PM. If you are new to my channel, then I would request you to go through the content of my channel, look at the videos, and if you really find those videos helpful and if they really heighten your interest, then do like it, share it, and do not forget to subscribe to my channel. And most importantly, please turn on the notification bell button so that you get notified whenever I upload any new videos on my channel. So now, without any further ado, let's get into the lecture. Aristotle, the famous classical literary critic. So, he was a Greek philosopher and critic, as we all know, and we can consider him to be the first popular literary critic due to his contributions in the field of literary criticism. He remained a student of Plato for 20 years, yet he was anti-Plato in many ways. He rejected, as you can see, Plato's theory of forms, and he also, disagreed with his views on poetry or on the role of a poet. He was more empirically minded, which means that than both Plato and Plato's teacher Socrates, which means that Aristotle was someone, who was empirically minded, which means he was concerned, he focused more on practical experience, okay, like observing things, experiencing things through senses rather than depending on theory or pure logic or on scientific principles. So he relied completely on practical experience, unlike Plato and Plato's teacher Socrates. He made significant contributions to logic, criticism, rhetoric, physics, biology, psychology, mathematics, metaphysics, ethics, and politics. He wrote dialogues and as many as 200 treatises, of which only 31 survive. Treatises are actually, a written document, an essay uh, approaching a definite subject formally. That is a treatise. So we can see that Aristotle wrote around 200 treatises. Aristotle was the first to classify human knowledge into distinct disciplines like philosophy, metaphysics, biology, and so on and so forth. He differed from his teacher Plato, like I said, in his approach to poetry or written verse. The former considered it an art, while the latter condemned it and regarded it as immoral and unethical. So we will talk about it in detail when we talk about the differences between Plato and Aristotle in the upcoming slides. So Aristotle's major contribution to criticism is the idea that poetry is an art with an object of its own. So this is the major contribution. While talking about poetics, usually the two answers that are available, that Aristotle wrote poetics, partially to answer to provide an answer to his teacher Plato. Yes, it is partially correct, because that's what we come across in poetics, how he, like, what he says about poetry, what he says about the poet. But taking into consideration his work poetics, we should believe that the major contribution that he made was to criticism, that poetry is an art and it follows a certain set of rules and principles, and it has a purpose of its own, and it can be rationally understood, and it follows a definite set of rules. Aristotle freed literature from Plato's moralism and didacticism, because Plato only keeps on talking about the negative effects of poetry, the poet as well, that the kind of influence that a poet casts on mankind or poetry casts on mankind. So Aristotle simply frees it. Yes, it's true that even Aristotle believes that poetry should serve a function, but the extreme degree, or let's say the degree, the extreme the degree to which Plato talks relates morality to poetry, that is not done by Aristotle. Rather, he considers the poetry to be rational and a beneficial activity, and in no way dangerous, harmful, or irrational, or immoral, or untrue. So he also believed, like Plato, that literature and art should serve a moral function to help educate the mass. But the problem here is the difference that lies between them here is that their approach was different. Plato believed that poetry can never serve a moral function. It is detrimental. It is unhealthy. It is writing poetry is an unhealthy practice. While Aristotle believed that no, poetry does have the function. Poetry can serve a moral function to help educate the mass. It can educate the common man. It has the capacity to educate the common man. So we can see the difference in their approach to poetry. Although Aristotle remained a Plato student for 20 years, but we should know that he was anti-Plato in many aspects, which means that there were different areas where he did not agree with his teacher, Plato. For instance, Plato condemned poetry, and he did not want a poet in his ideal republic, because according to Plato, the influence that is cast by a poet is immoral. It is an immoral influence that he casts on the public taste. Not only that, he says that poets should be banished from an ideal republic, because what he writes is just the product of his a state of irrational frenzy. While Aristotle thinks that poetry has a good, healthy effect on the human mind, and emotions should be encouraged and nurtured. He also denied Plato's concept of reality, or we can say the theory of forms developed by Plato, where he says that everything exists outside this physical world, and that reality can be found in the and Aristotle believed that reality can be found in the physical world itself, which means that Aristotle completely refutes Plato's theory of reality, or theory of forms, let's say, because according to Plato, these properties like beauty, it is something abstract. It is an abstract universal entity, okay, and it exists independently. It doesn't have to depend on an object. So we can find beauty existing outside this physical world, while Aristotle argues that this is not possible. If beauty exists, it has to exist in relation to the object, because the forms are intrinsic to the objects, and therefore beauty cannot exist as an abstract entity apart from the object. So if we want to study forms, or if we want to study beauty, we have to study in relation to an object. So this is how we find how Aristotle rejects Plato's theory of forms. He also refuted Plato's idea that only reason can help find the truth, and that's why Plato is so much against poetry. He's so much against the poet. He's so much against encouraging emotions and passions, because he feels that poetry is something that always waters our passions, waters the passions and desires of men, which is completely unhealthy according to him. So we should only encourage the reasoning faculty, and it is only reason that can help us attain truth. While Aristotle is saying that sensory organs are the source of knowledge. Yes, it is through our sensory organs that we can experience things, and that would help us gain knowledge regarding so many things around us. So we cannot discourage or let's say we cannot look upon our senses, or we cannot look down upon our uh, let's say feelings and emotions, because our sensory organs help us experience such emotions. So in spite of these differences that we can see here, still Aristotle cannot be considered completely democratic as far as the concept of an ideal state is concerned, because his philosophy of state also consists of the same amount of censorship that it did in Plato's time, which means for Plato, an ideal state, for example, okay, Plato's claims that democracy, he never supported democracy because he felt that there is too much of freedom in a democracy, and therefore it gives rise to anarchy. It gives rise to an anarchic system where everyone has a right to rule, all kinds of selfish people, and they are only concerned about their own personal desires, and in order to be powerful. That's why Plato does not support democracy at all. And when it comes to Aristotle, we find even Aristotle is very critical about democracy, because he says that democracy is uh, is something that actually undermines, okay, the rule of law. This is what Aristotle says, and he says that democracy is something. If we want democracy, constitutional, of course, he favored constitutional democracy, but then, like I said, even he had certain prohibitions. He also talked about certain prohibitions where he says that that the rule of law shouldn't be undermined. But this is what happens in democracy. So we see that as far as the concept of a state or democracy is concerned, more or less, like Plato and Aristotle, they do not differ much. And Plato feels that an ideal state should always be governed by people of wisdom, who have the wisdom of knowledge, and they can, serve for the good of the public, for the good of the common, who is highly educated, and they are very, very passionate people who are very passionate about truth. So they should be the rulers. And so he says that, therefore, who should be the ruler of an ideal state? So according to Plato, this ideal state should be ruled by the king, who should be the philosopher, the guide, and the ruler. So this is what Plato says, and for him, his ideal society should consist of these people like guardians, craftsmen, and auxiliaries, and therefore he proposes the banishment of poets from an ideal republic. So, as we are talking about the differences between Plato and Aristotle, so here we can see, like I explained in the previous slide, that Plato advocated banishment of the poet from a perfect republic, and Aristotle could only agree with a kind of poetry that has a moral function. Yes, Plato and Aristotle, they did agree that poetry should serve a moral function, but like Plato, who completely talked about the negative effects of poetry, Aristotle did not look down upon poetry, or he did not consider poetry to be something which is detrimental to to mankind. Like Plato looked upon poetry that it is nothing but imitative in nature. It only copies, and he compares poetry to painting, saying that what an artist does is simply copies and represents it. So therefore it is untrue and of course harmful and far removed from reality, because according to Plato's theory of forms, there is an ideal form, okay, and the object that we see around us, it is a copy of that ideal form. Okay, this is the second copy, and this object that is available to us, what a painter does, he simply copies it and represents it and portrays it on the canvas. So therefore, the presentation, the picture that is portrayed on the canvas becomes it gets twice removed from reality or the ideal form. So that's why he says that this cannot be accepted. It is imitative, it is untrue, it is immoral. It only conveys or portrays, false ideas. While Aristotle believed that this imitative quality of poetry, okay, cannot be detrimental. It is rather he claims that it is an act of learning, because according to Aristotle, since birth, we human beings, we have the tendency to copy, to emulate. Okay, and therefore it is a characteristic of every human being. And so he suggested that from childhood, humans have an instinct to imitate. Like, we often come across instances where we find little children, behaving in a manner that resembles someone else, an adult behavior. So it shows that how even a little child has the tendency to copy. So this is something very natural to us, and Aristotle believes that this imitation can be very fruitful. It can help us learn a lot, and therefore it therefore gives rise to a creative process. So for Aristotle, imitation is equivalent to a creative process. Every human finds pleasure in learning. Yes, even if we imitate, we learn something in the process, giving rise to something new or giving birth to something new. So that's why Aristotle says that imitation can never have a negative impact. Rather, it is a pleasure. It gives pleasure to the learner in the process, as the learner is able to learn something new, or let's say to create something, is able to create something new. So it helps in the process of learning, thereby providing immense pleasure to the learner. Five major works by Aristotle are as follows: Nicomachean Ethics, Politics, Metaphysics, Poetics, and On the Soul. So as far as Nicomachean Ethics is concerned, here Aristotle talks about the primary goal of human life, where he says that happiness, or to attain happiness, or to live well, should be the primary goal of human life. In Politics, he describes man as a political animal, and he says how democracy, how constitutional government, royalty, everything comes together, to cause corruption and tyranny. And in Metaphysics, he talks about the nature of things. And in Poetics, as we all know, which is considered to be a seminal work in classical literary criticism, he provides us with a theory of, like, or you can say, the fundamental principles, okay, to construct drama. Okay, he produces that theory of how we should construct drama through a study of the plays of Sophocles, Euripides, and epic poetry. And in Politics, he also talks about perfect tragedy, the constituent elements of epic poetry, how tragedy differs from a comedy. Okay, all these he talks about in Poetics. And as far as On the Soul is concerned, here he talks about developments. Here he attempts to understand the soul, and he tries to define its essential nature and properties. And he considers that this task, is the most difficult task in this world. So here he discusses the souls of different kinds of living things, like plants, lower animals, and humans as well. So these are the five major works of Aristotle, which contribute to his fame as a literary critic.